Hello and welcome to today's Situation Report. We'll discuss the situation in Ukraine, recent events at the front and what's happening behind the lines. Certainly one of the bigger reports of the last few days is that from the Ukrainian perspective, the main directorate of intelligence, the intelligence service, is saying that attacks from Transnistria are threatening. We want to talk about that and also about the significance it would have. In addition, there was another Ukrainian attack on a Russian tanker, which means the Ukrainian tanker war continues. This is happening while there is, of course, intense fighting at the front, and the pressure on the Pokrovsk and Myrnohrad pocket is being maintained. We'll discuss that and everything else that happened in this situation report, starting indirectly. CyberGhost VPN is sponsoring today's stream. If you want to browse the internet safely with a VPN and access content that's blocked in your region, click the link in the description and get 83% off plus 4 months free with a 45-day money-back guarantee. That way, you take no risk. A subscription, of course, supports the channel. The Ukrainians have once again attacked Russian targets in the rear area. In this case, an electronics factory in Chuvashia was hit. You can see here if the browser likes it, which it apparently doesn't like once again. Well, anyway, here you can definitely see the impact. And there in Chuvashia, an electronics factory was hit, which, among other things, produces receivers for navigation devices used by the Russian military. In addition, the Ukrainian General Staff says that the Temiruk port on the Black Sea has had 70% of its oil capacity damaged, that it was damaged there. That means here we see that the Ukrainian attacks on Russia's oil export capabilities are continuing to advance. We move on to the developments along the front, and that's where we begin. No change can be documented in the north towards Sumy. It's similar with Vovchansk and with Veliki Borluk. From the direction of Kupiansk, we have a change towards Pishchane. Ukrainian soldiers were fired upon by the Russians here. And as we can see, this is in an area that was recently still held by the Russians. This means the area is now at least contested, if not already under Ukrainian control. So here they would have pushed the Russians back. South of that, towards Borova, we have the Russians near Novovodyanna. They have advanced there. We have located them here at this spot. And here we can see these two notches and then this section, and it's quite easy to recognize. Here are the two notches and here is this section. That means the Russians have been in this area, suggesting they may have pushed the Ukrainians back to around this line. As always, it's a bit early to say that based on a geolocation, but at least this would be a possibility. That's it from the direction of Borowa. We'll continue towards Liman, and there the Russians have been seen northwest of Srednye. We have this here at this point, and as we can see, it's already about halfway to Korovia. That's at this spot here. The Russians were seen around this point here, so that's an advance of about 1.5 kilometers to the northwest. At least the geolocation, and the fact that geolocation doesn't always mean a permanent Russian presence, can be seen here. Yarova, a geolocation also took place there. Russian soldiers have been observed here entering this house. And afterwards this house was heavily attacked and largely destroyed. The house is then attacked from all directions with first-person view drones, bomb drones fire at it, it catches fire afterwards, suffers heavy damage, and so on. Of course, from the outside we can't say whether the Russian soldiers, if they were inside, are still alive, but we can see that this is the case. In the video, 3 Russian soldiers could be seen moving here at a distance of about 6 to 7 kilometers. From the confirmed permanent Russian positions, this is a classic case of infiltration, and just because something was geolocated, there doesn't necessarily mean the Russians are still there permanently. But basically we have that with every situation report. That's it from this direction. We move on towards Siversk, and I can't document any changes there. We only see that the deep state map is adjusting some things here with their geo, with their mapping, but we already noticed that in geolocation days ago, that the Russians have crossed the railway line in the middle and are already operating to the west of it. Now, the pro-Ukrainian deep state map shows Russians control the eastern half of Siversk. That means Siversk probably won't hold out much longer. The Siversk salient or front bulge has now mostly been pressed in or collapsed, is just about to collapse. South of that, towards Kostiantynivka, we have another minimal change. A Russian soldier was attacked by the Ukrainians here in the east of the city. That's like if you watch regularly, if you remember these fortifications, Ukrainians operated here, then Russians took the trenches, and now Russians are back on the city's edge. That's because the personnel density on both sides is relatively low, that it's just a few individuals with occasional patrols in between. But that means infiltration is always possible, of course, and also a quick replacement of the position by the opposing side. We just see the trend. Russians are advancing further into Kostiantynivka. You can't say they've gained a foothold there from that. That's all from this direction. I can't document any recent changes toward Dombropilya. In the direction of Pokrovsk, we now have several new geolocations. First, we'll start in the northwest of Pokrovsk. Here in these buildings, a battle is taking place between Ukrainians and Russians. According to what we can see from the geolocation, in the original video, the Russians were most likely defeated in this attack. That means we had a Russian presence here, but according to the video, that's probably no longer the case. At the very least, you can see in the video that several of the Russian soldiers paid with their lives for the attack. That's why I can't and won't show you the video. That's all from me. We haven't seen any changes toward Myrnohrad. We have new positions at this location. And here we have the Russians. Now, yes, let's say in the central part of Myrnohrad, if we refer to that as the southern part, here now at the western, southwestern edge of the main area of Myrnohrad and almost in the center. This means infiltrations are now reaching deeper into Myrnohrad. That could be because this is just speculation on my part that a retreat might be happening right now, because not only have the HT Pro Ukrainian deep state map now attributed this to the Russians, we could simply say that this would be a correction, but now we have the news here from the Ukrainian Pravda, according to which the Ukrainians have withdrawn from parts of the position. We've talked several times before about how these positions here were, of course, extremely exposed. And that's why it's a mystery to me why they stayed there, why those positions were held for so long. A withdrawal may have taken place there now. Of course, we can't say that. If the Russians took the position, they could have taken it from the Ukrainians by defeating them there, or the Ukrainians have withdrawn. Of course, we can't say that from a distance, but at least from the Ukrainian side, it said that they retook the position there, which in my view was certainly reasonable. And possibly the personnel in Myrnohrad is currently being reduced, and that's why we now have more infiltrations in Myrnohrad. That's just my speculation. Fighting continues in Pokrovsk itself. We still have a Ukrainian presence in the northern part of Pokrovsk, and we still have a presence in Myrnohrad. However, we can no longer say that all of this is under firm Ukrainian control given the geolocation because of the geolocation. One was here, the other there. That means we see the Russians are operating more or less throughout large parts of the city area, now also in Myrnohrad. That's it from the pocket. West of that, the Russians have entered the village of Novo Pitorodno. We have geolocated this at this point at the easternmost edge of the small village. They were previously in Molodesky, that means it's not far. That's about 300 or 400 meters that they crossed here in the field, but now they've entered the next village. It doesn't look like they were able to establish themselves there either. But at this point, we can still say that there was a local advance there. Towards Pokrovsk, we have a geolocation between Oleksivka and Orestopil at this spot here. And what's interesting here is that it's exactly at this spot. There, Ukrainian soldiers capture 6 Russian prisoners and lead them away. That means we still see Ukrainian activity here, counterattacks on the ground. They also take place in this direction and repeatedly capture prisoners, which are of great value to the Ukrainians, of course, because they hope to use them to secure the release of their own prisoners of war. That's it from the direction of Pokrovsky. Towards Huliapole, we have geolocation, and in Huliapole, the Russians are also advancing slowly. We have them here in this part, and we last had them in this part here. That means they're still on the eastern side of the river. What's the name of the river? Haitshur. They've been seen again on the eastern side of the Haitshur River. That should be right here at this spot. We then have another geolocation from today, and there they cross the river and are on the other side. That should be somewhere around here on this road. That means we see. The Russians are also slowly advancing in Huliapole, making the situation there problematic. Because the supply line to the north is likely no longer usable, so the supply lines to Huliapole here are also under heavy pressure. That's all the changes on the ground that we have. I can't document anything else. In short, overall, it hasn't changed. We observe slight but consistent Russian progress along the axis Pokrovsk, Huliapole, Myrnohrad. Little activity that brings success. Pokrovsk and Myrnohrad remain fiercely contested, with Russians advancing slowly amid Ukrainian counterattacks. And the Ukrainians are still able to hold their positions there, more or less. Kostiantynivka, the momentum is in favor of the Russians, but it's extremely slow. We're really seeing very little progress there. Siversk, on the other hand, is likely to be in Russian hands in the foreseeable future. Here it seems like the Ukrainians won't be able to hold out much longer. Otherwise, when there is some movement at the front, it's relatively little, and often the geolocations are just infiltrations, so that's it for the front developments. We have a new report from the Black Sea, and here is Riba, who is one of the biggest, or the biggest Russian mill bloggers, are reporting about a fresh attack on a Russian tanker, and there they say such attacks are a blow to our economy, just like the drone attacks on oil depots all over Russia. Drones are less effective against coastal targets now. Therefore, the Ukrainian armed forces have switched to more easily accessible targets. And as long as there is no suitable defense and no countermeasures, it's only a matter of time before the next ship is hit. So, from the Russian mill bloggers' side, they admit that the Ukrainian attacks are painful and that it can be expected that further attacks will be successful. We also have a video of the attack showing it and how high it sits in the water. That means it was on its way to be refueled. And here we can see how the first drone loses connection upon impact. The attack reportedly involved 3 drones, and we can see another drone arriving. At this point, and also here, the drone hits the tanker, so the tanker war continues. We've already talked about how if the Ukrainians are successful with this and reduce Russian oil trade, that, of course, this is an important thing for them in the war. Since the Russian economy is under pressure and oil revenues still make up a large part of their income. But the other report we have here is from Channel 24 from Ukraine, according to which the Ukrainians fear that there could be attacks on Ukraine coming from Transnistria. Just for explanation, Transnistria is on the other side of the Dniester. I believe that's the name of the river, and that's under international law. However, a part of Moldova is Russian-speaking and loyal to Moscow. They broke away in a secessionist war after Moldova's independence, especially because there are fears that Moldova might reunite with Romania. This was supported by the Russians, who actively helped the secessionists here to break away from the administration in Chisinau. There are also Russian troops stationed there, officially as peacekeepers. But unofficially, of course, they are there to support the independence of Transnistria. By the way, Transnistria has already demanded annexation by Russia 2 or 3 times through referendums, which has not been granted so far, but that way the Russians would of course have reached the Moldovan border. One could assume that in this case, the annexation would be granted. There are reportedly 1,200 Russian soldiers on site, likely recruited locally since regular rotations are no longer possible. That means effectively they are Transnistrians serving there in Russian uniforms, which is at least true for the majority. There is also a large Cold War-era ammunition depot being guarded there. How much is still usable is unclear, but it's mentioned in the article. It is also discussed here that this depot is only 5 kilometers from the border and could therefore be shelled even with mortars. Basically, they're not too worried because large parts of the border are formed by a river and the only bridge over it has also been blown up. But in 2022, part of it is a national border. And according to Ukrainian sources, drone production is already taking place within Transnistria. A production line has been set up there, and recruitment is also taking place for fighters who could then invade Ukraine from there. If this happens, it's clearly infiltration, so we shouldn't expect anything else. This is a major offensive. It would start in order to somehow attack the Ukrainians from behind and advance from Transnistria all the way to the Dnipro, or something like that. Instead, it would focus on small squads. The article mentioned 10 men crossing the border to cause damage in the Ukrainian rear area, carry out attacks, and of course mainly to tie down the Ukrainians. This ensures Ukrainians must deploy stronger forces here, leaving other front areas less protected. But it must be clear, if that were to happen, Ukraine could see it as a casus belli, in other words, as a reason for war, and respond militarily. According to the article, Transnistria itself only has 3 combat battalions, which are poorly equipped and demotivated. We must understand that from the Russian side, there's really no way to bring weapons there now. That means they are equipped with what can be produced locally, and at least assault rifles have been produced there. I don't know to what extent the production of larger military equipment at a professional level is taking place there, but there is at least heavy industry there, so there is some local production. That's possible, but in general, the armed forces there, the secessionist forces, are relatively poorly equipped and should have relatively little chance against experienced Ukrainian forces. On top of that, geographically, it's a disaster for the defenders because they can be broken up into small segments almost anywhere and then destroyed. So whether it will come to that is unclear, but we also have to be aware that the Russians, just by possibly even intentionally letting it leak to the public, are recruiting personnel there. Just by doing that, they are already making the Ukrainians seriously consider whether the forces they currently have at the border will be enough or if more will be needed. And if, from the Ukrainian side, they come to the conclusion that it could become dangerous and they don't have enough surveillance, then those are already forces that will be missing elsewhere. So from the Russian side, it's already considered a success no matter what. In my opinion, for the Russians to take that step and actually carry out an attack from Transnistria here would be madness on their part. If Ukrainians see that as a casus belli, and they likely could. And honestly, who would complain if the Ukrainians invaded Transnistria and took the separatist territory held by the Russians away from the Russian separatists? Who would complain about that? So from the Russian point of view, it probably wouldn't be a particularly good idea, but until then at least the Transnistrians can keep the Ukrainians on their toes. Then we have news from Russia itself. Specifically, Putin has signed a decree that activates the mobility reserve for training. I made a video some time ago and it has now been sent to you in the chat. What the situation is like with the Russian reserves and Russian recruitment. I came to the conclusion there that Putin will resort to the mobility reserve to use it in the war in Ukraine. These are volunteers who have signed a contract that is relatively lucrative by Russian standards. And the only thing they have to do for it is to train occasionally, but otherwise they are civilians. And the interesting thing about it is just that these contracts are lucrative. This allows the Russians to maintain a relatively well-trained reserve, which is currently said to be up to 2 million men strong, but which normally is not deployed and which also has no termination regulations. Based on my research, you can't exit this contract early, and after the first, it's usually for life. That means the people who signed there have absolutely no way to get out anymore. If the decision is made on the Russian side to deploy the mobility reserve in Ukraine, laws are already being worked on to make this possible. There have already been new laws that allow for an expansion of what can be done with the mobility reserve, but in this way, the Russians may be able to address their personnel problem. As I said, I made an extensive video about this, which was just posted in the chat. Otherwise, it can be assumed that this mobility reserve will of course be allocated for Ukraine. That means that in one way or another, they will be used to provide personnel for the war in Ukraine. However, we must also note that when new people from the mobility reserve are drafted and trained, they become involved too. Then they are newly trained and their level of training increases. Then you can also adapt them to the current tactics and experiences and teach them these things. We should also note this is useful in a broader conflict. If the Russians want to expand the war to other countries, then in this case they would have soldiers who are familiar with the new Russian tactics. Of course, that must not be overlooked either. In the political sphere, we have further information about the peace efforts. Alexei Shuravlev, who is the deputy chairman of the Duma's Defense Committee, says no matter who signs Ukraine's capitulation, Russia must be satisfied in the end. There's no doubt about what they want. You should appreciate the openness currently shown by the Russian side. Basically, you also have to say that Russia is currently doing everything to paint a picture of strength. Economic growth is being explained, even if it's only 1%. According to official statements, inflation is low. They're talking about 4 to 6%. How true that is another question. They're reporting big successes at the front, sometimes claiming cities are captured, even though Russians still hold about 30%. Let's just note that as well. Let's just state that. But we see that Russia is painting a picture to show an image of strength. These reports are often exaggerated or generously interpreted, and if we look at the facts, then Russia has 0 this year. 77% of Ukraine has been conquered, so less than 1% of its national territory has been lost by Ukraine to Russia this year. The whole thing always has to be understood in the context that it's not just about the territory, but also about the condition of the armed forces. Ukrainians can differentiate their territory. They can surrender more territory to cut losses or hold it longer and face greater losses. That's the debate about Pokrovsk and Myrnohrad. Should Ukrainians hold the pocket? So we must not misinterpret it here. That 0.77% doesn't mean Ukraine could last 80 more years in the war. That would probably be a wrong interpretation. But we still have to say that what the Russians have to show is very modest. All this came at the cost of hundreds of thousands of lives. I believe Ukrainians report over 300,000 Russian dead, wounded, and missing. The real number is probably not too far from that. Meanwhile, Russia is also increasing pressure in Ukraine's rear areas. According to the Russian ombudsman, there are plans to trigger protests in Ukraine in order to destabilize the government. Among other things, they plan to use mothers of soldiers who are prisoners of war or missing in order to increase the pressure on Zelensky, so to speak, to finally make peace so that their sons can come home. All this pressure is also supposed to be applied, among other things, because elections are not taking place. Because from the Russian side, the Ukrainian government is regularly portrayed as illegitimate, which would also render its signature on a peace agreement invalid. That's an important point that shouldn't be forgotten. If the Ukrainian government is illegitimate, which it is not from a legal perspective, but that's how the Russians portray it. And by now this is also being repeated over and over again from the United States. So if the Ukrainian government is considered illegitimate from one side's perspective, then it can't sign a legitimate agreement. That means if they sign a peace agreement, it would be somewhat ineffective and could, of course, legally legitimize a future continuation of the war. We have to understand that in this context. In addition, Trump and Putin keep calling for new elections, probably to get rid of Zelensky. Zelensky calls the bluff as they say in poker. He says, fine, we'll hold a new election if that's what you want. I don't have to stay president. If the partners guarantee security for the organization for 60 days, then there will be new elections. That means he's saying, hey, I don't have to stay in office, help me make it happen. Of course, we have to be clear how that's supposed to work is a mystery. Who is supposed to run? What if a frontline soldier wants to be a candidate? How can he do that or campaign? How can the soldiers at the front vote? Is the whole thing supposed to take place by mail-in voting? While the United States has been demanding this the whole time, and with Donald Trump, they have a president who is vehemently fighting against mail-in voting. That means the whole thing is kind of exciting, but he says, hey, it's fine by me. You'd have to ensure security for 60 days before you could vote immediately, and even 60 days would be very ambitious. We have to be clear about that. It's also interesting that there are surveys. Only 10% of Ukrainians support immediate new elections, while 63%, almost two-thirds, oppose new elections even after a ceasefire. They say new elections should happen only after a peace agreement is reached. Two-thirds of Ukrainian voters, but it's also interesting to see what would happen if new elections were held. Because Zelensky's approval ratings have plummeted, only 20.3% of Ukrainians would vote for President Zelensky. That's true, but you must understand he's still the most popular candidate. The most popular candidate behind him is Valery Salushny with 19.1%, and the third is Kirill Budanov with 5.1%. That means the former chief of the general staff, very popular and well-liked, and then the head of military intelligence. And now we can ask ourselves, what do Trump and Putin actually expect a President Salushny or a President Budanov would sign regarding peace in Ukraine? What do they expect? What would be the outcome of negotiations there? Do these two seem like softies to us, like people who are ready to give up half the country just to satisfy the Russians and the Americans? You could say that as military men, they might assess the situation better and reach a different conclusion than politicians. Of course, you can do that, but it has to be clear that we're not exactly seeing candidates here who you would expect to just roll over and beg for mercy. Here's the thing, a new election doesn't guarantee things will get better for the Russians. That has to be said clearly in this context, because at first glance, neither of the two alternatives seems more accessible for Russia. Here's another update. Good news for Ukraine. It has now received 2,000 Senator armored vehicles of the Senator type from Canada. These are MRAPs that have a small turret on top to provide fire support from this type and from this turret. These vehicles can be used to some extent in an attack, but they are more suited for the rear area. We must recognize that, especially now, anti-tank weapons used by frontline soldiers are rare, with most tasks handled by drones. Armored vehicles are crucial there. And with these vehicles, there are numerous videos where they survive 1, 2, or even more hits, and the crew on board is only slightly injured or even unharmed. That means even if these vehicles aren't the best of the best, not the best you can imagine, they still surely save lives almost every day in Ukraine. That clearly shows the West can significantly help Ukraine if it chooses, because 2,000 vehicles is no small matter anymore. We have to make that clear at this point. And that's it for today's situation report.